This course is the first of two parts, actually. The first part is the 12 apostles, as defined in the New Testament. Part 2 is on apostles that are named in the New Testament that were not part of the 12, the original 12. So that would include Paul and James the Just and Barnabas and Andronicus and Junius and Matthias.
All the other S's.
All those others. But we are going to go through the 12, and this course has a kind of a very specific focus that we're using a variety of resources. Because what I have discovered in my life, and perhaps you also, is you've grown up and you always hear things about, well, this apostle preached in Turkey, or this apostle preached in India, or Peter was the first pope and he was in Rome somehow. Well, none of this stuff is in the New Testament. So where did those legends come from? Or is it history? Where did that history come from? So we are certainly going to use the New Testament as our primary guide for this course, but it will not be our solely one. We will also look at what's known as church tradition, which usually means the early church fathers. And there's two particularly that we will be looking at. The ecclesiastical history written by, let's see, is Gene here?
Yes.
Written by Eusebius. If Gene wasn't here, I would have said Eusebius. I would have recognized him. But since Gene's here, written by Eusebius, who was bishop of Caesarea in 325 AD, and some of you will remember he was pals with Constantine, had an integral part in the Council of Nicaea. He wrote the biography of Constantine's life, and he wrote the first church history. So he got to call it the church history. We will also be using Hippolytus, who was actually a little earlier, and there's a tract called On the 12 Apostles. First off, Hippolytus, where you may have heard that name before. I mention it sometimes in the church service. The Apostles' Creed, the earliest version of it, we have dates to 212 from a tract on baptism by Hippolytus, and it was actually part of a baptismal creed that they would say, okay, do you believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ? And you would say yes, yes, yes. He wrote a lot of stuff, and one of them is probably on the 12 apostles. The reason I weaseled out and said traditionally ascribed to him is some modern scholars cast some doubt on that. However, my view is if the Catholic Encyclopedia says yea, verily, then I say yea, verily. So therefore, Hippolytus wrote
It's very Roman of you.
on the 12 apostles. I figure Catholic Encyclopedia is the source for stuff on the early church fathers or the saints, or, you know, I do not use the Catholic Encyclopedia if I wanted a biography of John Calvin. They have a long one, but it is not the first place I would go. But the early church fathers, Catholic Encyclopedia, if it says so, yea, verily, and that's the end of the discussion. I also use some apocryphal works. This is really a apocryphal with a small a, or simply what that actually means in Greek is hidden, but we're not using it in that sense. We're using it in a modern sense of dubious authority. In other words, there's a whole bunch of Gospels that were written in the 2nd and 3rd century. There are a whole bunch of Acts written in the 2nd and 3rd century. The Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Nicodemus, the Acts of Thaddeus, the Apostle. And they're all considered spurious, i.e. they were written by people 2 or 3 centuries after these people died. So we're not referencing them because I consider them to be divinely inspired, or I put them on the same level as Hippolytus or Eusebius. The reason we're mentioning them is some of the legends that we know today, when we say so-and-so preached, Thomas preached in India, it actually comes from these apocryphal works. So what I try to do is trace the legends back to what their source material was. Here are the New Testament lists of apostles. Some of them are more challenging than others. You'll notice like the first 3, they're exactly the same. James, son of Zebedee, in Luke and in Acts is simply referred to as James. And there are at least 3 Jameses, prominent Jameses mentioned in the Bible, all 3 of them apostles. And when it simply refers to James, who's it talking about? Let's see, Judas is not mentioned in Acts on the list of apostles. How come?
He's dead.
He's dead. He's gone by that point. Let's see, Simon and Peter can be confusing. Simon the Zealot can be translated either as zealot, which makes people think he was a member of the Jewish revolutionary group, but it could also be Simon the Zealous, I mean, like zealous for the Lord. So sometimes, like these mini-series they've had in the past on Jesus' life, I remember one of them has Simon the Zealot secretly plotting to overthrow the Romans and all this stuff. And like I said, you could translate that just as easy, that it was Simon the Zealous one. This is an interesting one. This requires some interpretation. We have a Thaddeus in Matthew and Mark, and we have a Judas, son of James, in Luke and Acts. So here we have yet a 4th James, although not a prominent one. Here we have a 2nd Judas, and one of Jesus' brothers was named Jude. So you can see how all of this can get very confusing. So if it talks about Judas, is it talking about Judas Iscariot? Is it talking about Judas, also known as Thaddeus? Or is it talking about the brother of Jesus who wrote the book by the name Jude?